the Central Board of Secondary Education, CBSE, the Australian Council for Education and Research, ACER, and Sahodaya School of Complexes, Gurgaon chapter, we accord a warm, heartfelt welcome to all the esteemed dignitaries. As we approach our 62nd Republic Day celebrations, it's a moment of great pride and honor that CBSE, in collaboration with ACER, has organized this international conference on development in assessment. We have amidst us an enlightened group of resource persons who are going to impart valuable inputs about classroom teachings, assessment practices, and education management. It is indeed an honor to listen to them and imbibe the best practices being followed all over the world. We now request our first speaker of the day, Professor Jeff Masters, is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council for Educational Research. He holds a PhD in Educational Measurement from the University of Chicago and has published several books and numerous journal articles in the field of educational assessments. Dr. Indu Khetrapal, to welcome Professor Jeff Masters.
Good morning. What do I do? Just take it? Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that welcome. It is a great pleasure for me to be here from Australia to be part of this very important conference, focused as it is on the improvement of assessment in school education. You will notice from the screen that I have changed my title, the title for my presentation, a little to make it Assessment for Improved Teaching and Learning. This focuses a little better on the content of my presentation and what I want to say this morning. If we think about traditional approaches to the assessment of student learning, I think you'll agree that many of the approaches that we've used over the years have had a particular view of the teaching and learning process. And assessments have been conducted primarily to establish what students have learnt that we've taught them. So the view that's underpinned this approach to assessment has been that the role of teachers is to teach, the role of students is to learn that content, and the role of assessment is to work out how much of what teachers have taught students have successfully learnt. So that's a traditional view of assessment, a process of establishing or evaluating how much of what teachers have taught students have learnt. And very often in that process, we have reported the results of assessment as percentages. For example, students have achieved 80% or 90% of the content of the course, or we've converted that into grades, letter grades, A, B, A+, or other forms that indicate how much of what teachers have taught students have successfully learnt. What I will be saying today, this morning, is that assessment can also provide another important function in school education. It can also meet the needs of teaching and enhance student learning. So my focus today will be not only on assessment for evaluating how much students have learnt, but also assessment for the purposes of improving the effectiveness of what teachers do in their classrooms, assessment for enhancing the quality of student learning, and also assessment for monitoring the progress that individual learners, individual students are making across the years of school. So this will be my focus. Not arguing that it's not important. I won't be arguing that it's not important to assess how much students are learning as a result of teaching, but what I will be arguing is that alongside that, it's very important that we think about forms of assessment that provide feedback to classroom teaching, that allow teachers to improve the quality of their teaching, and that allow us to monitor the progress that individual students are making over time. In thinking about all of that, in thinking about teaching and learning and the improvement of teaching and learning over time, it's useful to think in terms of an improvement cycle. In schools, what we're interested in, ultimately, is improving outcomes for students. These outcomes could be traditional academic outcomes. It could be achievement in first language or mathematics or science or other subjects of the curriculum. But I'm using learning outcomes quite broadly here to also cover cross-curricular skills, higher order thinking, other kinds of outcomes that as educators we're interested in seeing students develop in our schools. So that's the intention of our efforts as educators, as school-based teachers and school leaders. And ultimately, of course, beyond that, our intention is that by improving learning outcomes for young people in our schools, we will be improving the quality of their lives. We will giving them knowledge for life beyond school, preparing them to go into further education or training, giving them skills for the workforce once they enter the workforce. So the ultimate intention of our work as educators is to, as I say, improve life consequences for young people in our schools. Is a good understanding of what we're dealing with. What's the situation that's confronting us? As a classroom teacher, I need good information about the students in front of me. What are their current levels of attainment? What are their interests? What are their motivations? How can I connect with them? As a school principal or a school leader, a head of school, I need good information about how my school is performing. As a leader of an education system or as a government, I need good information about the current status quo, the current situation, the problem that I'm dealing with, if there is a problem. It's important that I have all the information that I need, that I'm across the detail, that I'm not in the dark about the situation that I'm confronting. So the first step in this cycle is developing a good understanding of what we're dealing with as educators. Second thing we need is knowledge about how to improve. It's one thing to know what the current situation is, it's another thing to know what to do about it. So as educators, we need, through experience, through practice, through research, we need to develop a good understanding of what's likely to make a difference, what's likely to work, for whom, under what conditions will particular initiatives, programs, actions make a difference. And as we build that knowledge base as a profession about highly effective practices, what's likely to make a difference, then we're also in a better position to create innovative new solutions to the problems that we confront. So knowledge about what we can do to make a difference either for individual children, within a school, within an education system is the next important component. Normally, taking action also requires resources of some kind, money, physical resources, staffing, human resources of various kinds, encouragement, support. So to take action, wherever we are in the education system, whether we're a teacher in a classroom or a school leader or a system manager, it's important that we have an understanding of the situation we're dealing with, an understanding of what's likely to make a difference, the necessary resources, so that we can then take action, introduce interventions, introduce new programs, new initiatives that are designed to then improve outcomes for students and, as I said, ultimately improve life consequences for those students. So these are key elements of an improvement cycle in school education. But the other element, of course, that's very important is feedback. It's very important that there is feedback once action is taken so that we can evaluate the impact of what we're doing. As a classroom teacher, we need to be able to stand back and to look at what we're doing and to say, is it having an impact? Is it making a difference? Is this, in fact, an effective way of teaching, of addressing student needs? Similarly, if we have other roles in the education system, it's important that we evaluate the actions that we're taking. And of course, as that feedback is provided, then we update our understanding of the situation. Situation changes as a result of actions that we've taken, and we now have a new understanding, perhaps a better understanding also, of what's likely to work in the future and what resources we might need. So I'm starting this presentation this morning by thinking about this improvement, this teaching and learning improvement cycle that has the elements that I've just outlined, one of them being feedback. Assessment has an important role in this entire process. Assessment has an important role in two places, at least two places. Firstly, it's important in helping us understand what we're dealing with. How are students currently performing? What are their current misunderstandings? What errors are they currently making? How are they performing in comparison with other children of a similar age? How are they performing in comparison with children in another state or perhaps in another country? So assessment, first and foremost, plays an important role in this process, this continual improvement cycle, in helping us to understand what it is we're dealing with, the situation that we confront. Assessment also has an important role in helping us to understand the outcomes of our efforts. Have we succeeded in making a difference? How much improvement has occurred? How much have children grown as a result of our efforts as educators? So assessment plays a role in both these places in helping us to understand the current situation and helping us to evaluate the effectiveness of what we've done and to assess the outcomes of our efforts. As I said at the outset, this is a slightly different view of assessment from the traditional view of assessment, which is just how much of what I've taught has the student learnt. Under that model, the onus is pushed back onto the student. It's up to the student to do the learning, and the role of assessment is to work out how successfully the student has learnt. The onus is not so much on the teacher. What I'm saying here is that there is a big role for the teacher in this process in understanding where children are at and in evaluating the progress that they are making over time. So when assessment is used in this way, it becomes part of an ongoing cycle of monitoring and improvement. The first question, if we're thinking about a teacher in a classroom, is where is this student currently up to in his or her learning? What's this student's current level of achievement, for example? And coming out of that is the question, what can I do as a teacher or as a school leader to advance further learning, to promote further learning for that student? Having then taken action, undertaken teaching, undertaken an intervention, the next question is, where's the student now up to in his or her learning? And perhaps what progress have they made? And so on. The question then is, what can be done to promote further learning? So this becomes a cycle in which I'm constantly, as a teacher, establishing where students are up to in their learning, working out what I can do to move them on, to promote further learning, reassessing to establish what progress they've made, working out now what the most effective actions are likely to be in promoting further learning. In the CBSE context, the introduction of continuous and comprehensive evaluation provides an opportunity to improve this cycle, to improve this process of ongoing monitoring of each student's progress, providing feedback to the classroom teacher, to students, to parents, to help them understand where students are up to in their learning and what they can do to promote further learning. So continuous and comprehensive evaluation, as I say, has the potential to feed right into a cycle of this kind, a continual improvement cycle of this kind. If teachers in classrooms are to use assessments to improve their classroom teaching, to promote further learning, then a first thing that teachers require, pretty obviously, is a good understanding of the learning process itself. They need a good understanding of how students learn. They need a good understanding of the conditions that support learning, and of course what they can do in particular to support student learning. So as educators, learning is our core business. It's what we're on about as a profession. It's the reason that we exist. We are here to try to promote learning in the current context, learning in schools, but in education our mission is to improve outcomes learning generally for learners. Over recent decades, we have developed a better understanding as a profession about learning, about the conditions that support learning and what happens when people learn. And this morning I just wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting on some of the things that we are learning about learning. I'm certainly not going to cover everything that we're learning about learning or that we have learnt about learning. That would take several weeks at least to try to cover that. But I am going to focus on just some things that we are learning about human learning. And the reason for doing that, of course, as I said, is because teachers and educators need a good understanding of learning if we're going to think about how to make best use of assessment to improve learning outcomes for young people. One field that is starting to give us a better understanding of learning is brain science or neuroscience, research into the brain. This is partly because of new imaging technology that has been developed that allows us to see where in the brain particular activity is occurring. Now I have to say that there's a great deal that we still don't know from neuroscience about learning. There are many myths and many misunderstandings about the brain and misinterpretations of findings from neuroscience. And I don't think there's a lot that we're learning yet from neuroscience that we can take into the classroom next Monday morning and start implementing. But there are some things we are learning, and I think it's important to just be aware of a few of these things that we're learning. One of the things we're learning is that each human brain, is unique. Of course, all of our brains develop along common lines. Much of brain development is pre-programmed, and so there's much that we have in common as our brains develop, and our brains indeed have much in common. One of the things, for example, that occurs from the time of conception is that the brain starts developing brain cells or neurons. It develops billions of these neurons in the weeks and months immediately following conception. In fact, the brain overproduces the number of neurons it will need, and in the period before birth it starts pruning back, eliminating neurons from the very large number that it initially produces. We don't know why the brain produces so many neurons. We don't know the mechanisms for pruning back neurons, and that pruning process, no doubt itself, contributes to differences at the time people are born. But in the weeks and months immediately after birth, we know that what is happening is that connections between these neurons, these nerve cells with their tentacle-like extensions through which they communicate with each other, the connections between these are built, and they're built very rapidly. And again, the brain develops many more connections, or synapses as they're called, than it will actually require, and starts the process of pruning these back in response to the individual's experiences. So this process starts, as I say, before birth, indeed, and continues in the weeks and months after birth. In the early years of life, what's happening then is that connections are being built, connections are being strengthened, some of them are being removed if they seem unnecessary. By about 3 years of age, each of us has about 6 times as many connections between nerve cells as we had when we were born, and about twice as many as you and I have as adults. So this is a very active process of strengthening connections, weakening connections, eliminating connections that don't seem to be necessary in the human brain. For example, to give you an example of that process, as we learn language, all of us when we're born have the ability to hear certain distinctions between sounds. But if they're not important in the mother tongue, if those distinctions are not important, then we start to lose the ability to hear those distinctions. We can't any longer tell the distinction. So in Japanese, for example, the distinction between the letter as in right, and the letter l, as in light, is not an important distinction. And so by 10 months of age, Japanese babies have lost the ability to hear that distinction. And this is just an example of the kinds of developments that are occurring within the brain. And the brain goes on through life being shaped by experience. Of course, there are structures that we have in common in our brains, but the sizes of those structures differ from one person to another. The neural networks, the pathways that are developed in the brain are different from one person to another. And we know that children who are raised in deprived environments, in environments where they're not stimulated, experience reduced brain development, presumably because the brain is responding to the reduced needs of the individual. So the brain goes on being shaped by experience through life, and it's shaped in response to sensory input. It's shaped in response to our experiences as individuals, so that two individuals of the same age will have quite different pathways in their brains, quite different networks, and in some cases structures that are of different sizes as well. We're also seeing from neuroscience that, as I said, particular areas of the brain are responsible for particular activities. We know, for example, we already knew from research into people with brain injuries that people who experience injury in the parietal cortex section of the brain have difficulty saying what number comes between 3 and 5, but have no difficulty telling you which month comes between August and October. So there's a function that part of the brain serves. We can also see from these images of the brain that even simple activities often require multiple parts of the brain to be used. So there are networks across the brain that are being used in the learning process. In learning to read, for example, there are fairly clear patterns of activity within the brain that are common across individuals, differ a little from language to language. People who are learning to read Italian, for example, will show different patterns of activity from people who are learning to read English, and people who are learning to read Chinese, not surprisingly perhaps, show different patterns again. But even simple numerical activities often require various sections of the brain to be used. We can also see that some processes are more efficient than others in the sense that they require fewer areas of the brain to be used. So there are some ways of solving mathematics problems, for example, that are more efficient because they require the use of fewer areas of the brain to solve the problem, whereas other solutions, other methods of solving the problem require the use of more of the brain. And when we learn languages, as young children, when we learn a second language, we can do that in an efficient way, making use of less of the brain than you and I have to use. We can still learn a second language, of course, but in that process, we need to make use of more areas of the brain to do that. We also know that, as I said, the structures of the brain are increased with use. We find that musicians, for example, have larger areas of the brain, larger physical structures associated